whatever industry you're in, we all face these macroeconomic conditions right now. Like the world is being gripped a little tight right now, and all of us, I'd say, suffice it to say, whether it's on a personal level or a business level, we're all trying to figure out a way to squeeze that just a little bit more to try and get a little more output with a little less kind of cost or overhead. And certainly when it comes to Davey and Julio's kind of presentation and Max's discussion there around trying to figure out how to be more efficient from an IaaS to a PaaS mode, and thinking about DevOps and thinking about how these modern technologies can help enhance the business while either keeping cost at parity or the win-win if you could reduce your cost and add more value to your business. Like that's when you're actually truly gaining competitive differentiation. Lance is going to bring into this discussion around data and data governance, and having spent about 6 months with Lance here as colleagues, I've learned a ton, and a big part of what I've learned, and I think it's probably intuitive to all of you, is this notion of you've got all this data and there's an endless amount of possibilities of things you can do with that perhaps could add more value to the business, perhaps could make you more competitive, perhaps could differentiate, perhaps could increase revenues, decrease costs, those kind of things. But it all starts with where the heck is this data? Who owns it? How do I get access to it? What file formats is it in? And how do I pull all that together in a pretty simple way so I don't burn my whole budget just figuring that out? So hopefully I'm not stealing too much of your thunder.
I was just going to say,
hopefully I'm on. Well, this is truly where my knowledge ends. So I'm going to pass the baton to Lance here, who's going to take this now to the 100, 200, 300, 400 level. So over to you, Lance.
And so to keep with the theme of do more with less, I'll tell a little bit of an unflattering story. Is that, so I've been with Enviro for about 6 months, and before that, I've worked with a couple of other smaller boutique firms, but as well as I spent about 6 or 7 years with IBM managing their advanced data analytics practice in Western Canada. And I think about the third week, I get to Enviro, and they see one of our clients is like, well, we're thinking about data governance, and, could you send me over just a slide deck of what your methodology would be? So in my head, I kind of, rattled loose all the stuff I was kind of doing over the last 10 years. And the client turned around right away and said, it looks like you gave me something from IBM or Gartner. So it's way too big. It's way too theoretical. And it was absolutely 100% right. And so over the last 4 or 5 months, I've really been kind of going back through my experience, and then as well just cultivating something that's a little bit more manageable, a little bit more defined, and something that allows us to an approach to start with data governance in a small way, and then start to build up into it. Okay, so that's just a little bit of my framework here for today. Is like, how do we do more with less? So how do we take advantage of the things that we're doing right? How do we recognize those? How do we understand the gaps, and how do we then strengthen those? So, but to start, has anybody seen this picture before? Couple of people. So this image was based off of data collected in during the Second World War, and they were taking data sets from planes that actually returned back on bombing runs, and each of these dots was a cumulative of bullet holes in each of the bombers that they have come back. And so they all started to think after the analysis saying, well, hey, you know what? These are the places in the service areas of the plane that we should be actually increasing with additional armor and protection. Right? And it was a Hungarian mathematician named Abraham Wald came up with the observation saying, well, the data set that you're looking at is only the planes that returned. What about the planes that didn't return? So what you're actually seeing is probably the inverse of what you really need to protect against, right? So it's really was the first start of what they called survival indicators. So for us, as we look at things, sometimes we analyze what we see, but we don't analyze what we don't see. So the only reason why I'm bringing this today is just when the concepts or the themes that I'm presenting today, look at it from that lens as well too, because I really want to understand your guys' perspective as well too. And there may be some things that I'm either saying or not saying that, take a look at it from the inverse, and I'm really interested to hear people's perspectives as we go. All right, to start, because we talk about data governance in such a broad term, I thought maybe just a quick poll of the room, well, I guess I'll start with this. How many people have like a data governance kind of initiative in their organization? Couple. How many people do not have any data quality problems? right? So just maybe anybody want to share just before I said data governance, like what comes to your mind? Like how would you define it within your organization?
Yeah.
Anybody want to
We're still defining it.
still define it?
Yeah.
Yeah,
We haven't got it nailed.
The ability and limitations of sharing, that's one example.
limitations of sharing the data.
Ability and then limitations like the access, the flow of sharing.
Right, so kind of getting the ability to get that data into the hands of the end constituents so they can actually do something with it. Yeah? Anybody else?
I can say that data lineage in particular is a continuous improvement initiative.
Yeah.
You go down that rabbit hole.
So trying to track back to its original source, understanding what the modifications were made and why do I have two product numbers that are talking about the same description kind of thing? Okay. All right. Yeah, so it's a real broad term and so so I just wanted to kind of to start that off. So here's the topics I wanted to cover today. So just in a general sense, like just so I can kind of share with you what my definition or our definition of data governance is, and not saying that that's the right one, but at least you can kind of filter then what I'm saying through that lens. And it very much aligns to Microsoft and probably is not going to be any surprises in there. But I want to also talk more importantly, data governance as a program. And I think probably most of us have heard that, you know what, data governance is a business, should be a bit in all instances, hopefully is a kind of a business driven activity. We set it up as a program. It's not a project because it's continuous, a sense of continual improvement. But how do we get started with that? What does that kind of look like? And what are some of the kind of key themes that kind of draw out from what we see as a successful data governance initiative? And then here, just assessing your data governance capabilities. So just an approach on, okay, how do you sit back and say, well, where am I today? How do I figure out my strengths, my weaknesses, and how do I play to the things that we do well and understand the things that we need to improve on? And then the last is data governance within the organization, which is kind of sometimes the most important piece, right? And so those are the topics I wanted to cover today. I'll start with the first, data governance defined. So data governance, goals of data governance. We may have heard some of this before, but you want to be able to overcome data that's in silos, right? Either through different applications or different data source data, whether sometimes that's external, sometimes that's internal. Increased data agility. I think maybe that's a little bit back to your comment, right? How do we quickly get data into the hands of the users, right? We're seeing a lot of this depending on the industry you're in, but complying with industry regulations. So a lot of times is that we actually need to provide some auditability, right? And some adherence to certain policies or standards or regulations that state that our data needs to be in a certain place and needs to be reported in a certain way. And we need to be able to kind of justify and approve that. And then, manage growing data landscapes. So I think we passed long ago that we realized that the data landscape is actually increasing. And over my experience over the last 15 years is that every time someone asks for some data, that almost increases their appetite for data. So it's almost like this cyclical kind of growing that the more that we solve a data need, the more somebody says, well, I need more data. Where you think it conversely would be true. So there's really this paradox that data is an asset, but it's also one of our biggest challenges, right? So data is an asset. Obviously, we know it improves business decision making. It allows ability to understand what has happened and why, and it allows us to understand what may potentially happen and why, right? But also it's a real challenge. So we have data that's sometimes isolated in different silos. Different business groups have different perspectives on who should own the data, who should remediate the data when there's data quality issues. How do we understand and come to grips to a common understanding of what the data is and what it's not, what should it be used for, what it shouldn't be used for. So there's this really juxtaposition between the data as an asset, but it's also sometimes our biggest kind of pain, right? The other thing that I want to paint for you as well is a little bit of my observation. So I have traditionally, probably over the last 12 years, have come at analytics from a pure play analytics perspective. So, give me your tool, show me where the database is. Okay, now we'll go to work, right? Whether it's creating a data warehouse, whether it's doing, streaming analytics, whatever it is. So, name the pure play tool, Cognos, Business Objects, Information Builders, MicroStrategy, SAS. I probably work with about 8 or 9 of them. If not, I've worked for half of those companies. So, but most of those came from where we have the data assets, we have some infrastructure, we have some data, some database server sitting somewhere that has the data on, and then we have the analytics platform, just in a generic sense where, there is maybe some overlap depending on if we're doing cubes or depending if we have some, the analytics platform provides real-time integration. But if we look at, and this is kind of more from an on-premises perspective, but if you look at now, is that the data assets, there's a lot more overlap between the analytics platform when we talk about the cloud and the data assets, and even more so when we talk about the infrastructure. So this is what for me was a real kind of like wake up call that you really can't do much in cloud analytics unless you have like the Davies and the Maxes and the Julios of the world looking after the cloud infrastructure. Right? It's really hard. You can't just have the analytics guys just go crazy and say, here's your tools, go to it, unless you have this infrastructure kind of thought out, the landing zones, all the security, all the access, all the services that are provisioned in a way that doesn't ring your bill to 3 times what you're expecting it on a monthly basis. So there's a real collapsing of what analytics, the tools and analytics and also the need to and the platform from the cloud perspective. So there's this real compression of that. And does that make sense? Like, is anybody else kind of seeing that or experiencing that? Is that like or maybe I was just late to the game, but I remember it just kind of hit me in the head going, holy crap, like this stuff really is, you can't really do this stuff now unless you have really people that know the cloud infrastructure, regardless of the data assets. That's really kind of a determiner. And, and I think that it kind of segues into us and Vero as a company as well, where our strengths are. But I wanted to point that out because that does play into not only that is because the platforms are different, but traditionally, even if we're on the cloud, we've got the data warehouse structure, we have our database, we have governance and security. So we either are securing our assets either by, by tables, by rows, by columns, by access credentials. And then it usually resolves in some business intelligence or SQL analytics somewhere. So some information delivery vehicle, dashboard, report, cube somewhere. But if we move now to more on the cloud, is that the data structures are now not necessarily table driven, right? We're talking about files, we're talking about folders when we're talking about data lakes, right? And so really, if we talk about data governance, is that the use cases, for data governance, sometimes it gets strained because there's gaps in between these two technical approaches, right? Or environments. And environments, I mean, like even if you're on the cloud, right? You can, the analytics architecture you have can be quite drastically different. And so there's really is kind of there's a lot of incompatibility between security and governance models. And so really in this, you kind of see what I was just hoping the data governance would help with was like, data, we created silos, just the platform or the data architecture itself has created kind of data silos. And I think that so when we think about, data governance, we have to start thinking about it in those terms too, as having a broad enough kind of bucket for that. And it doesn't get any less confusing because you can have governance for, cloud governance, right? For your infrastructure, right? Max would probably talk about that for hours with you. You could have data governance. We have a client that actually wanted for us to do a governance assessment for their Power Platform, right? And so it really becomes dicey as kind of what we define as governance, data governance, and sometimes these architectures are put more pressure on that definition. So I kind of pulled a Gartner-ish type of definition of what data governance is. So kind of data governance helps organizations to better manage the availability, usability, integrity. Well, you guys can read that. I really don't like that description anyway, so I kind of went with this one. It's the active management of business information as an asset, leveraging people, process, and technology. So, and I wish they kind of renamed this to information governance because really the data, when we talk about data, it has such an internal looking view to the IT side, right? We've got data, we got bits and bytes, we got tables, we got rows, we got columns, we got files, we got folders. But that really is useless to the end consumer. What they really want is to get information out of it. It's the whole point of analytics, right? So it's really about how we're governing the data assets to produce information. That's kind of where I kind of look at it from. So any thoughts on like, I mean, does this resonate? Is this kind of, yeah, I just wanted to kind of slim back all the wordiness, and also too, is that it's really an active thing, right? Data governance should be an active thing. It's a behavior. It's a thing we're doing, right? And again, so, kind of business information, people process, and the kind of the interconnection between that. One of the things I didn't put on here for today was the technology side. So the technology, I think, is really an enabler, right? So if I think of, let's say, Purview or Databricks, Unity, but I really didn't focus on that for our conversation here today, really, because the biggest point, I think, when we talk about data governance is really the people process side of the equation. The tooling, yeah, it can help. It's an enabler, but I've never heard anybody say we've got great tools, so our data, that managed to overcome any other challenges with people process. So I just see some head noddings, kind of makes sense. Yeah. All right. So data governance. So just some other definitions here, just to kind of baseline, right? So data quality kind of embeds underneath data governance, but we can't really confuse the two, right? Just because I'm focused on data quality doesn't necessarily mean that I'm, have a good stewardship of the data or the information so everybody's using it the same way. It may be syntactically correct, but I really haven't applied a kind of a business perspective or a data stewardship point of view on top of it. Data management, the technique to manage the data, while data governance represents. So this one here, it's like the how we manage data is different than the rules and policies that we need to implement. Okay, master data management, just technique to manage the data. So how do we get to a single source of truth? Again, data governance represents the rules and policies around that. And information management, that is in generally saying, like, as we move data to the consumer, what is the consumer doing with it? So they give, you built this nice dashboard, they dump it into Excel, right? And then they change it. Well, that's more, that does kind of fall into, there's some aspects that fall underneath data governance, but that's really around information management. Sometimes we'll see document management or unstructured data kind of fall into this kind of broad term too. Okay, so I just wanted to kind of, just kind of baseline these, just so we kind of have an understanding of some of the terminology. All right, so target benefits of data governance. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. Sometimes what really kind of gets missed is the increased efficiency and productivity piece. But there's always a lot of focus on the improved data quality piece. And the improved data quality piece is really difficult because when we're trying to engage with the business unit of what the value of data governance is, we come to them and say, listen, we will improve your data quality. And the business goes, yes, great. And then we say, you need to fix your data, right? And so there's data quality. I'll talk about that a little bit more as we go, is how do we get, what's some of the strategies to get the business engaged or the stakeholders engaged in a way that allows kind of a joint kind of balance between those that are the custodians of the data and those that are actually the owners and the consumers of that data. Okay, so here's just a couple of things that I think that really that are requirements for effective data governance. And I try to highlight just kind of some of the key verbs. So it's really about orchestrating the people and the processes and enabling the technology to kind of have best practices around how we're going to manage our data assets. There is the aspect of data quality. So when we talk about data quality, it's just not syntactically is the data correct. When I think of data quality, I mean, is it business correct? Right? Do we have the associated metadata correct aligned to the data so it's consumed in a proper way? So I wanted to separate. Sometimes we see data quality and we kind of lump in like, hey, that was a 1, but it should have been, a 0 in that field. That's syntax, right? And I'm sure a lot of our historical systems have produced kind of, increased the, our need to focus on data quality over time. But that is a lot easier problem to fix than it is to say that when the data is syntactically correct, are we consuming it in the correct way? Do we have a calm and shared understanding of what that data should be used for and what it shouldn't be used for? So I just want to split those out. Because data quality, we can say, hey, we can treat it as an IT activity. We'll profile the data. There's tools out there to help us kind of show the anomalies, the exceptions, and then we'll give it to the business. They can fix it. But that gets you kind of some of it. That doesn't really get you the business side of it. And most organizations really find out once they fix the syntactic side of the data, is they realize, well, we have people interpreting it differently. And how do we align to that? Classifying and controlling data to maximize its effectiveness. It's kind of a little bit around the auditability and being able to understand data lineage. And then more and more as we go in these days, obviously privacy and security around our data assets, and reducing our risk around that is more and more important. All right, so here's what tends to happen is that we can have an understanding of, yes, we understand data governance is good. The components underneath it, which I'll get to in a minute, are important as well. But your manual fixes really never work, right? They're not sustainable, and they always kind of end up missing the kind of the bigger picture. So you may have business analysts or data scientists or even your end users or data engineers, where they're trying to kind of, it's almost like I have this kind of the analogy of like trying to put your thumb into like a dam, right? That's ready to kind of, that's about to burst. And then there springs another hole, the cartoon, and then you put another thumb into it, and then you put your toe in it, and it just keeps springing leaks. So when we look at it just from a manual perspective, or trying to do spot fixes, we really never kind of hit the nail on the head, right? It tends to be kind of working maybe in some limited fashions, maybe in certain data domains or very limited subject areas. But from a holistic perspective, it's really not maintainable, and it never really kind of holds. So I won't go through each of these, but just the theme that sometimes we are doing data governance, and sometimes it's just a little bit more manual than we realize. And so it's important to just kind of to understand where we're actually trying to solve the need in a way that's inefficient, or maybe not the best way, or in a way that's more efficient. So the key principles for data governance, from my perspective, is really kind of around kind of three main areas. So transparency, so understanding the life cycle of the data within your organization. Where is it generated from? What's the steps it moves through? Sometimes it actually doesn't move to somebody. It moves into another application, right? And so sometimes there isn't human innovation with that data. It's integrated. So, but just really what that transparency is. Okay. Standardization, so aligning to definitions and talking the same language, so that we have common stewardship of the data, so everyone knows what this one piece of data means, and accountability. So really is that it's accountability for people who, for making the decisions and around data remediation. So who actually owns it and who's actually responsible for it? Sometimes those definitions can kind of get blurred. I'm gonna move through here because I'm not on time. So here's the key kind of main tenets of data governance. And I've kind of grouped them into two areas. One is around data governance oversight. So those are around policies, and those are around processes. So some of the kind of core things that are the bedrock that no matter what you're doing within data governance, you kind of have those things in place. And I've grouped those into two kind of categories, policies and standards, and then I call it escalation and arbitration, but in essence, what's the mechanism that we use when somebody says, well, no, this piece of information should be interpreted this way, and somebody else says, no, it's that way. We need to have there has to be some common understanding, and not saying that one needs to succumb to the other, but the context of what should be considered when is important, and then having a consensus around that. So that's that bucket. And then the other five are really around business glossaries, or typically a data dictionary, around data quality, how the data is being changed, right, and the auditability around that, privacy and security, and then lineage and auditing. So I just grouped those as kind of seven kind of main tenets or grouping of things within data governance. Now, if you look at Gartner, if you look at a couple other kind of smaller kind of boutique type of companies, they could probably, some of them have 9, some of them have 5, but in general, you're probably going to find the core theme, right? There's going to be stuff around data quality, stuff around policies and processes, there's going to be stuff around auditability, things around security. So I just want you to keep in mind, because when we talk about these, we also need to keep in mind that we need to look at them from more than one perspective, right? We need to look at it from not only just the process side, but the people side, the ownership side, and the technology side. And for data governance, the biggest challenge is the change management side of the equation. Out of any data governance program I've been involved in, and it's been quite a few, it's always the change management piece that is the heavy lifter, right? And unfortunately, sometimes that happens once we get all our data together, we get all the policies written and documented, we understand, we build out our data dictionary, and then we bring it and say, okay, well, now we need to set up the data governance committee and get people doing it. And then all of a sudden, that's where the thing drops. even if you have executive sponsorship, because it's the people at the end of the road, and I'll talk about this a little bit more, that have their hands into the application. They are the ones that you need under the tent, because really nothing's really going to happen unless you have them bought in. Right? All right. Okay. Data governance as a program. First of all, any questions on that? Any altering views or anything maybe I would have missed or something that, you know, is kind of surprising? Okay. Here's a question I wanted to ask is when we look at data governance, for those of you that either are, you know, have either thinking about or in the journey of a data governance program, within your organization, is it IT or business initiated? So in other words, where did the grassroots come up from? So anybody want to share the experience in their organization? Yeah.
Traditionally, I think IT just kind of takes it on because everybody looks at it in terms of the data that we have in the technology platforms of an organization.
So
But unfortunately, but
why is it, from your perspective, why do you think that is, that IT is the one who ends up kind of they're the ones that start with, you know, the banner?
I think it's just the view of the business or the stakeholders that, you know, oh, it's a system. So therefore, it's an IT problem.
As the custodians of the data, so they get the phone calls?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. But, you know,
Yeah.
I certainly think that it has to be business initiated. Because data itself is not just from a technology perspective. Data actually exists in all parts of the business.
Yeah.
So from a responsibility perspective, the business has to initiate that governance process across all areas, right? It's not just specifically IT data that we're you know, custodians of.
How about anybody else?
I think it's a tricky question, actually. The reality here is that if you look at data as an asset, you have to take into account how the business actually stretches and uses its assets. And effectively, there's not only a cultural and political consideration there, there's a systematic consideration. And as much as people in the technology field perhaps want to believe they're in that level of control, they simply aren't. So there is a necessity of a partnership with the organization, and looking at the problem in the multifacets that are presented. There isn't, I think, a very clear answer here. It's different for every organization.
Yeah, right. And there's also a difference between where it started or where it germinated from, or who originally saw the need and who should actually end up taking that torch. It's like the Olympic relay, right? Yeah, I may have started with the torch in Athens, but I'm passing it off to somebody before I get to Rio.
I think it's also important that the actual constraints that are being evaluated here are being looked at for what they actually are. There are certain things that business leaders, consumers of information or producers of information that perhaps they just simply aren't aware of. It's not their responsibility to be aware of. And fundamentally, the pace of the business, where it's going in its direction, can be fundamentally affected by just the culture, essentially, of the organization. If somebody knows they're going to grow, an IT leader can look at that and go, you've got a constraint or a problem in this particular system that's going to restrict how you're actually going to execute. The flip side of that is a business leader could look at the information that needs to be yielded and recognize what needs to be changed, perhaps logically. Right? But there's a happy medium somewhere there.
It sucks when you're in IT and then what you really thought was you have a data problem. No, you have an organizational problem, right? Okay, like, I mean, that's kind of above the pay scale, right? And a lot of what I've seen is like in the business area, like in the business units, let's say either by data domain or you're in the business, data quality is enough because they're functional. They're still doing their job. The data quality is enough for them. But that doesn't mean it's enough for everybody else. And the conversation becomes this, well, I need you to do something, even though it may not benefit you specifically or your group specifically or your business area specifically, but it helps the rest of the organization. So then it becomes, especially when they're the owner of the data, they're going, well, we're good. Yeah, but data flows. So if you look down, down the current, well, are people, areas of the business, are they good with that data? Right. And so it's really, it's almost, you slip right into the organizational conversation right off the start. Yeah.
I think it's, related to ownership, right? So at the end of the day, applications are owned by the business or business stakeholder. It's not owned by IT.
But, and I totally agree with you. And then what happens is the business says, yes, I own this application. It's good enough for us. Like, I mean, I've heard that, right? But that doesn't, but when we're trying to actually, for us data professionals, like we know that when we combine data from A and B, you get synergies, right? And so now you're trying to take data that was good for somebody, or good enough, and now you're trying to use it throughout the organization. It becomes, right? So, yeah, it just, but there's always the devil's advocate, no matter which way you look at
But then
it.
that data can change as well and will change as it moves through the organization. Like day one, it might be with your development. Day three, it'll be with legal and sales.
Yeah.
Like it's never going to be one owner. So
Yeah, and I think that's why data governance is never really kind of a one and done. It always is kind of like, you know, you're kind of like you're floating down the stream and you're trying to grab branches on the side of the, of the banks, and then you hang on too long and you just keep going anyway. So I think that there's a fluidity around this when we talk about data governance, because as you mentioned, I think data is really fluid. Anybody else have any kind of comments or thoughts? Like, I probably couldn't have asked any more of a generic kind of high level question that could leave like no interpretation, right? All right. So, designing the data governance program, this is more from an Enviro perspective, a little bit my perspective about when we talk about a program. So how do we kind of those 6 or 7 tenets I mentioned, how do we start to, what do we do with those? How do we wrap those up into a program? But just before I kind of get to that piece, just fundamentally, it's really, there's no sense in really kind of focusing on, you know, the whole point of data is to drive some business impact or value, right? That's why it's there. The data is there, hopefully, to help the business do what it needs to do, right? So having a focus on data governance as it relates to business impact, I think is a good place to be thinking. I think when we think about doing less is more, there's the practical side and there's a theoretical side. And all of our organizations, you know, each one of you know your organizations the most, and the practical is going to be different for probably each and every one of you. It's going to be likely slightly different, if not marginally different. And then there's lots of frameworks and maturity models. I'll cover, just draw attention to a couple of those. I think that it's really going to kind of help as we're kind of thinking about data governance as a program. And one of the things that I wanted to stress is like, focus on what already exists and working. Because at some point, like the data isn't bull crap. People are talking, like it is doing something. There are always some, like things are never black and white. There's still likely a lot of things that are either maybe not as efficient as we hope, but are things that are really, you can pick and choose and pull into something that says, listen, we're already doing data governance somewhat in some way. And sometimes that's a really good place to start. Right? So sometimes, you know, I always think about it like what we focus on grows. So if we figure out all the stuff that's bad, well, then we find a whole bunch of bad stuff. If we figure out, well, what we've been doing well, then sometimes that actually has a halo effect and we produce more. And then also too, there's really kind of not really kind of like go to A, B, C, D, now you're done, right? Kind of that waterfall, right? Think of it more iterative, right? Is that, you know, it's like, you know, we try something, some of it works, maybe it doesn't. It's like a painting, right? Well, I should maybe going to use a little less yellow in this painting next time. Maybe I'll use more red. Like there's this kind of refinement as we go. And the next slide or two I want to show is just a way to start your data governance program in a way that allows you to have that refinement as you go without paying too big of a price because you did everything all at once. And then I just stress that, you know, it's really about continuous improvement, right? And sometimes you don't know that things are working until you actually kind of try something. So I'm just going to describe these at high level steps, and then I want to walk into something that's a little bit more practical, because I think that's really kind of will help kind of illustrate some of these concepts I'm talking about. So the general steps would be 1 to 8, right? Have a data governance framework, right? So have a way to kind of understand the pieces that should fall in your data governance program, right? Maybe auditing isn't, or maybe security and privacy isn't as important, right? Maybe other pieces are. Maybe some of those tenants can be broken up into smaller fits, right? So understand just the thematically, what are what are the pieces around data governance that's really important to your organization? Identify stakeholders. I think that's a no-brainer, but it's really hard to do because you do need a dance partner, right? So you need executive sponsorship, but you also need somewhere in the business, if you're IT, saying, listen, that they're going to be able to take this on, or they're going to be enthusiastic. They're going to be an engaged partner for you to kind of help them get a business or a use case that you can actually vet out to actually produce some business value. Data stewardship is an important one, and that's really about who in the organization knows what the data should be used for. When it's not, it can traverse both the IT and the business side to help have those conversations. Is responsible for encouraging the business to remediate their data so it actually flows correctly from source. And it's the person that actually probably knows more about how the data is technically and its business meaning. And I've seen organizations from a data stewardship where they'll actually second someone from the business and throw them in IT and call them the data steward, right? Because they're grabbing that business knowledge and then bring them into IT as a flag bearer for the initiative, right? I've seen others where it's just been, no, the business actually just naturally has a subject matter expert or two, and they become the data stewards. And I'll talk about the role a little bit more. There's obviously the tooling aspect of things, educate stakeholders, but the one that I think is really important is to monitor and measure success. And the next slide I'll go through is we kind of talk about how do we roll out a program, is to make sure that there's kind of this sense of being able to understand what you're doing and be able to monitor it, because it's good to understand the own improvement, understands what works, it doesn't, but it's usually a prime indicator of ensuring that you're aligned to some business value, and it makes it easier to fund a program that actually has something that's a measurable benefit, to be quite honest. And it also helps you get engaged with other business areas or subject matter experts that you can have to execute on the data governance program. Again, back to this, most of it I've seen has been IT stumbles across it, they raise it, and then it's a struggle. Okay, how do we get the business to get engaged without them feeling threatened that you're actually going to okay, now you've got the flag, now it's yours. That's a long process. Okay, all right, so this piece here, let's go. Owns the data. I'm going to skip over this. There's one slide. This slide I want to talk about is that, and we talked about this, I think it kind of, somebody mentioned, is that, the application owner really is the one who should be kind of at the front of the trough, right? They're the one at the top of the stream. They're the ones who actually know what the data is. They're the ones who should be able to mediate the data. They should be the ones who actually know what the data is. They're in essence, should be standing beside the single source of truth. But when we look at that we can sometimes look at things from a data domain perspective, right? Either it's either financial data, it's production data, it's inventory data, but also we need to look at it from the business domain perspective. Right? And so it's a way of being able to understand what our data, the view of the data assets, right? Where we're just not looking at what's the function or the vertical perspective of the data, but also, we may have financial data that's in 3 different systems. So looking at it from a application perspective is important, not just from only a data domain. And usually this is where hopefully the data stewardship really comes in, right? And again, we realize that also impacts, not only the data owners, the data stewardship, but also the custodians of the data. And so again, it's not to overwhelm it, but it does become quite matrix. And a lot of the things I'm talking about, there's more of an art than a science, right? There is a lot of nuances, and those nuances sometimes are really only best vetted out on how you know your organization. Right. Some key rules. We have those that own the data, those that understand what the data should be used for and what it shouldn't be, and help kind of sponsor or implement, shepherd the policies and processes around managing the data. We have the data consumers, those that are actually upstream and consuming it through dashboards, reports, whatever, and the data producers. And sometimes the data owners and data producers are the same, and sometimes that they're not. Just have a list of Okay, so here's the slide I really wanted to get to. Okay, so we've labeled, we know who our data stewards should be. We've got some data quality leads. We've got an executive sponsor. We know who the data custodians are. We got the data owners. We've got all the roles. We got names for all the roles. So what? Right? Okay, so like, what do we do? Right? And so here's one of the things that I've kind of been refining as a model that kind of help germinate the data governance program. So the first, if we remember, out of those 7 tenets, really the kind of the base is around oversight. So coming up with policies and standards. So in other words, who's in what roles, here's how we understand when data is being corrected, those types of things. And then escalation and attribution, which is really what's the organizational structure, data governance council or working group or whatever it is that actually helps to vet out when there's conflicts around what we think the data is or is not. And usually the best place to start is to find a business problem and attach it to one of the areas of those tenets. So let's, in this example, let's just say data quality, right? And sometimes there's this kind of matching of saying, well, I really think that data quality is the one that we really need to tackle as an organization. And sometimes you shop for a program for a pain point that a business unit says that pain point so important to them that you can say, that you then have that dance partner. Sometimes it's more, no, you need to find what the business problem is and pick out of the tenets which one you should execute on. But the idea here is to pick one or a subcomponent of one and derive business value only to that. From that is really what you're doing is think of it as a center of excellence. If anyone's familiar with the analytics center of excellence. So every initiative that you do, you're doing it to drive the business value of that initiative, but it also has a little bit of a tax to it. That tax is to contribute to the program in and of itself. And so if you do that, then finding the next kind of area of business value that you can align to, you then kind of say, okay, well, where else are maybe one of these other tenets that I can actually pack on now that I have some experience on how we're actually managing data quality. Hopefully you're going to drive some business value, and then that in itself starts to mature you and actually contributes to the policies and processes that are actually managing the data governance itself. So you kind of get the theme here, right? And my animation is a little bit slow here. And of course I had to animate the entire thing. Is that you kind of can start to kind of be additive in the things that you do as you're improving business value through each initiative that you do. Now, again, is it ever going to look as clean as this? Likely not. But you'll find that the business problem you have, you'll probably have one core of those tenets that you're focusing in on and probably some tertiary ones that are there probably in a smaller percentage, right? And then if you're focusing on that with not only just coming in with the end of mind of saying, not only are we just going to meet the initiative, the business value required for that, but when you're also doing it to say, listen, I need to extrapolate the things that we're doing into a larger program, it makes it way more easier than trying to come up with all the things for the program and then trying to find a bunch of business partners to actually jump into the pile where you can say, listen, all this is valuable to you. Do you have a problem that matches all these things I bought or that I built? And so it just allows a way to be kind of cumulative and kind of a continuous kind of way to continue to add in. And sometimes you cycle back, sometimes you skip a step, but in general, where you can start small and start to add in. And really there is real small because the small isn't defined as to how much data did I fix. The smaller the big is not the business problem. The smaller the big is the business value. Right? So you can do some very small things. You can fix only a small subset of data from a quality perspective, and that's super valuable. Right? The business value isn't always correlated to the amount of data you fixed, right? Or the amount of ability to audit your data. So I just want to keep that in mind too, is that's why this is important, is that the size of your data quality program is really not relevant outside of what's the business value you can kind of drive. And if you have that from a more micro perspective, then it makes it easy to justify the macro. Right? And also too, it's really hard to kind of get past the first step unless you have somebody that you kind of provide some value to, because it's how do you convince the business that says, listen, I want you to fix your data for, the business unit for, 4 hallways down when you really don't have time, you don't have budget, and the data's working for you. Even if you have strong executive sponsorship, that still can be even harder. Okay. Does this make sense? Like, is this kind of? Okay. Any thoughts on this? Like, I mean, is this like, I'm always kind of interested to see, how many people are trying to do the big bang and how many are going, listen, you know what? We've got this problem over here, so let's just start here and kind of move forward. The more sense that, the more and more that as this kind of continues to kind of mature, I'm seeing more and more of the latter instead of the former.
Iteration is important.
Yeah, because then it allows you to actually self-correct. Getting too far, like you're head over your skis, right?
Learn from your mistakes, be flexible, recognizing, at least in my realm, all I got to do is typically wait a couple of months and there'll be another acquisition and it'll redefine the problem or present new opportunities. So.
Yeah. But also too, because it has such an organizational context, it's almost, there really is no guidebook that can give to you that says, here you go. Like, I mean, just check it off, right? Because the only guidebook will be is the guidebook that you come up with, and that comes after the effort of going through all the pain, right? So, but there is that kind of like of just, being additive. And so what I wanted to convey is that you can really have a successful data governance program in a small bits. Like Everest has never climbed in a day. Right? They climb up the first base, you get the base camp, then they acclimate up up to the second base camp, back down to the first, right down to the bottom again. And then they do it again up to base camp 3, back to 2, back to 1. That's okay to have that mentality because our true north is still trying to measure and provide business value. And as long as we're kind of in that sphere, well, then it's good stuff. Okay, we're doing time. Oh boy. All right. I'm going to flip through these pretty quick. I always tell clients is like, try to come up with, adopt a framework or a maturity methodology, or pick somebody's. There's lots of frameworks. Like Stanford has a really good one. Gartner has theirs. IBM has theirs. I think IBM and Gartner partnered on one. Microsoft hasn't really kind of put a stake in the ground and says, here's our data governance model. But you'll see a lot of literature, they'll reference to each of these. We have our own as well too, and it's not a surprise. It usually kind of looks like a picture like this, right? So again, like the Gartner or the Forrester wave, right? Least mature, most mature, and kind of, all the way from unaware to optimized. But the important part too is when you're looking at where your strengths are, where your weaknesses are, look at it from an individual perspective. Like, this is a really simplistic kind of picture here, but you don't need to look at data governance as like, am I mature or immature? Like, it's a lot more refined than that. It's way more refined even what I put here, right? What about data quality? What pieces of data quality? Syntactically, business, metadata, right? Timeliness, right? Sometimes the quality of the data is reduced just based off the timeliness. Right? I worked with a client where they had 85, they were a co-op. It's a large US hardware manufacturer, and they had about 500 or 600 stores across the US. And their data quality only went up when, when they got closer in the evening, when each kind of franchisee was submitting their data, right? So it wasn't whether the data was syntactically correct or that they understood it. It's just, no, they had to get the whole pile in before it's actually could be considered of quality enough for them to actually start to use it. So my point is that, make these your own. I had a client here not that long ago where their framework that they used was they came up, they kind of had these tenets here, like kind of groupings, and they came up with like 15 questions that they wanted to answer in each group, right? How do we measure data quality? Who's responsible for data quality? How bad is the data quality? Who's fixing the data? They just framed it as questions that they wanted to be able to answer from a data governance program. And in those 50 questions segmented across that became their framework. So answering those questions to say, yes, do we have an answer to that? And B, is that answer correct? Or is it, we want a different answer to that? Or no, there's no answer at all. That tells them where they are and serves as kind of a frame, as a guiding light or a North Star on what they should be focused on and not. So there's lots of different creative ways to kind of get to your own framework. It's really about just what are the guardrails? Like, when kids go bowling and they have the, in the gutters, they have the little fences up, or guys like me that use. Yeah, that's what you're really kind of doing, just to make sure, okay, we want to be able to have a lane or of things that we're kind of really focused on. So this client, yeah, that's what they did, is they used all these questions and they said, well, we need to adopt this to a framework. I'm going, well, you guys have the framework, you have yours. So just reorganize those questions and start to figure out what the answers are. And when you don't have answers, that tells you something. If you have an answer, that tells you something. If it's the right answer, it tells you even more. If you have the wrong answer. And also too, is ask more than one set of the organization a question to that answer. Because sometimes a business is going to tell you a different answer than what the ITs guys are going to tell you about where's, who owns data quality. That in itself is also tells you something. So there's lots of ways to derive information to influence, your approach or what you should focus on in a data governance initiative. And I just kind of wrapped it up and just called this kind of like a framework. Okay. All right. Moving quickly here. Can I have till about 12:30? Okay. All right. When you're assessing, this is the typically steps that we follow through when somebody says, hey, can you help us get a bearing as to what's working good for us, what's not, uncover things that we should be focusing on, and how do we wrap those up into initiatives? Initiatives that we kind of go back to that slide I was illustrating, that was kind of a continuous set of initiatives. So the very first thing is to understand the current state. So understand what's working, what's not, understand the perspectives of those, not only, from varying stakeholders. Right? It's easy to get that information, but if you just ask, right? It's amazing what people will say, and you realize that there's lots of varying answers depending on where the organization is onto one question that may be very, very simple, right? And it also uncovers areas of where, hey, we kind of have a handle on this. So why would we focus on improving at something that's 8 out of 10? Why don't we go pick something that we can actually improve on, right? So current state, define a target state. Where do you want to be? And then there's usually this synthesis, right, of, okay, here's what we found, here's what the gap, we'll understand the gap to the target. But really, this place is really where you really want to start engaging the business to start to kind of get them into the loop. You've used probably some of their time in getting the understanding of what things are and what they want things to be. But this is really in this area is just not for to go back and understand, say, okay, here's what we want to do with data governance. So it's a great time to start to that collaboration that you need, to finding a business unit that's actually going to engage with you for maybe some potential initiatives that you're thinking about. I'm going to talk about operational framework in my next set of slides, but that's really just the organizational piece, right? What are some ideas on how to get this kind of through the organization? And again, there's no going to be right or wrong. It's going to be organization, it's going to be dependent on each of the organizations, but just some ideas where some are more federated, some are more centralized, some are more distributed. Just going to give you some high level models around that. But really, this is the change management piece, right? This is the organizational piece. So it does include, the roles and who should be doing what and those types of things. But it's really around the structure of what's the organizational structure we need to kind of keep those wheels in motion for a data governance program that's continuous. All right, recommendations and alignment, and then really coming up with a set of initiatives, right, that are aligned to an overarching kind of set of goals. So that's generally kind of the process that we use. And I would say that, most consulting organizations or internal organizations kind of follow the same step, and maybe in different formalities, but generally those would be the steps. So it's really hard to understand, great, I can see that what our current state is, but you really need to directionally know where you want to go. Understand what the things of value that are strengths to use. And again, the operational framework, which I'm going to move into here pretty quick. All right, data governance. So I'll pause. I talked about the assessing your data governance capabilities pretty quick. The only thing I want you to take from that is just to take a step back and understand what's working well, what's not working at all, what's working kind of well, and where do you want to go. Keep in mind those tenets that I gave from a people, process, technology perspective, and you'll probably come up with a pretty good heat map as to what can kind of guide you to what the next steps are. Then you can start to apply maybe that methodology I indicated about just coming up with targeting some initiatives, right? And then kind of additively kind of create the program. Okay. Last question. for initiatives such as this, like, let's say data governance, do you see that it's more, how do you see your organization reacting? Is it more of a top-down approach? So in other words, we have an executive and when the big hammer says thou shalt and everyone stands to attention and they all execute? Or is it more grassroots where it's actually brought up from either, the subject matter experts or IT, but then actually kind of infects the rest of the organization with their data governance ideas and then kind of blooms throughout the organization? Kind of, how is it just a poll of the room?
Top down that I've seen.
I think it's a conversation between bottom up and top down. It has to be a conversation that, or else it's not going to be effective.
Some organizations react well when the executive says, thou shalt, and others are like so distributed that that doesn't work as well. They get more momentum when it's actually, down more at the application ownership. Because they're the ones who's actually getting, they're the one feeling the pain points of it.
Yes, classic strategic versus tactical kind of consideration here, so. Yeah.
Again, it just really, I raise this just as for food for thought, right? I've also seen it too, where you kind of like, you kind of start from the top and you start from the bottom. You kind of hope that maybe in some way you meet in the middle, or at least where you see each other in the middle and the gap is not so far that you can kind of reach across the chasm, right? But there's multiple ways that this can germinate, right? There's, and I've seen it where, they'll have, where everyone says, well, no, you need an executive sponsor, really strong executive sponsor. I've seen it where it's been successful, where they've had, I don't want to say a weak executive sponsor, but they've had, an executive cheerleader, right? Someone who's just helping them navigate the organization and greasing the wheels to make sure that, knocking down roadblocks, constraints, those types of things, right? So there's all these subtlenesses and nuances all are really kind of individual organization. And the reason why I put this up there, because there's really no right and wrong answer, right? Like everybody says, well, you can't do it without an executive sponsor. I've seen it, right? There's one client I had, the guy was he just knew everybody and he kind of knew the politics. He kind of knew the corners of the dark, the shadows of the organization. And he was kind of an engaging guy and a leader. And he just didn't really fall in his portfolio, but he was just a good advocate. Sometimes that's it. Sometimes you just need a strong enough advocate, and that's enough to kind of do things. So I sometimes just want to make sure that we got to get lost and, the Gartner says you need an executive sponsor or you're doomed. Think about the role, the function, and how that plays in your organization. I think that's more important. There are different ways to organize this, and I try to generalize it a little bit. But really, there's kind of at the operational level, right, where we have, those that are the data stewards, the data kind of owners, the custodians. And then usually there's a leadership group, either formal or informal, that kind of helps approves the policies, kind of, enthusiastically espouses their value, tries to kind of be the, arbitrator when there's differences of, data quality or data meaning or those types of things. They try to then, when it becomes of areas of time or budget or effort, then that's really the kind of the area that actually brings that to the executive sponsorship level. So without it being, and I've seen where, it doesn't have to be too hierarchical, but there's usually the kind of the grassroots. Then there's kind of, more of those that are kind of in the know from the subject matter expertise or the data governance. And then there's usually the kind of the top, the sponsor, the advocate, or the leader. Okay. So just keep an eye, a mind in those. And I've seen different mechanisms where, the data governance program reports into the CIO, and then they have representatives from, on the app side, from the data domain side, from the, individual kind of, application space, right? That kind of the data domain. I've seen it where the data governance program has representatives from different divisions, and each representative is responsible for mitigating or managing across the line of applications and the data assets that they have. Kind of seen it where it's kind of like more of a hybrid where it's kind of the data governance is really all into the business, right? And IT really only just gets some emails about, run this or run that, or if we fix this, you can update that. Right, where IT is probably maybe of a less of a role. I've seen this obviously less. And then kind of just kind of a mix and match where it's really becomes now not domain specific, but as it would be here, but it's really kind of like business unit specific. Right. So again, each has their pluses and minuses, but the kind of key considerations really is around kind of where you are and how mature you think the organization is, best practice that you're trying to use, and it's really kind of the culture and the people in the organization that really kind of dictate that. And you probably already have examples of other initiatives that have a certain pattern, and aligning to that sometimes is valuable. Okay, here's just an example of one customer of how they set it up. They have a data governance council. They have the project management office kind of dotted line into it. I guess it'd be kind of back. The data governance council kind of lets the PMO know that says, listen, we have these types of initiatives. We need a project manager. I want you to take this on, right? So they kind of get their kind of approval from the projects and get those registered as formal projects. So each initiative is an actual formal project, just not an activity. And then what they did is they kind of organized it by data, by in essence role, where they have a process, those that are responsible for the process, those that are responsible for the source, the process, the source of the data, and those that are actually owning the data. And they've done it across the source applications where the data sits. Then they've done it to where the data ends up residing. So in other words, whether it's in the data lake or the data warehouse, or where the analytics place where the data sits, right? Because sometimes that is different because there could be multiple copies of these, right? Depending on the different applications you have, but it tend to get centralized into a data warehouse or data lake or some form or fashion. And that perspective needs to be held. And then a little bit farther out is really kind of on the reporting side. And they have roles that are associated with reporting, so on the consumption side. Now, it's kind of tends to be stacked more time and resources, more stacked on this side than that side, right? So once the data starts, once the data governance program starts getting running, usually this becomes a smaller and smaller piece because hopefully, they may need more data, but really they don't, the governance is really kind of helping them use the data. I just wanted to give just that kind of a view of it was an insurance client that I had. We'll send this deck up. This is really just some of the typical data governance processes that would kind of fall within when we talk about data governance program. And one of the things we talk about is about kind of being able to understand, document what the processes should be. And this one, I just kind of used at a high level across some of these kind of main areas that I talked about before. And this is really just an example of a race across the roles or the grouping of roles across the top that this client had, right? So they kind of went more from a data governance kind of council and committee that had representatives from different business areas that would then be the ones who actually kind of weighed in on what the data initiative or the data governance initiative should be. And then that went down to to those that are executing it with the project manager. And again, you can kind of break this down another layer. So if I took just escalation and arbitration, you can see that there's a bunch of different activities that we can do. The thing about data governance I want to warn as well too is that you want to document enough just to be functional so you can actually have some guiding posts, but you don't want to fall into the documentation trap where, all we're doing is documenting our data dictionary. Well, that doesn't help anybody use it, right? We're documenting all these processes. So in other words, you can't do data governance on paper. I guess that's what I'm really trying to say. You need some paper, but you can't do it just on paper. It's really the act of doing. Themes for maintaining data governance program. I would kind of talk about some of this. Conduct regular assessments. So when I said, check on, we say like, what are we strong at? What are we weak at? It's always nice to understand when the first time you did that, the methodology that you used, then to go back and after, 6, 12, 18 months, just do it again. And where do we find that there's differences, right? Because there'll always be new stuff. To communicate with stakeholders, I almost should have said this, collaborate with stakeholders. Communicate means like I'm telling you something. So I sent you an email, you should be good. it's way more involved than that. It's really the collaboration, right? It's really the partnership. Monitoring data quality, I kind of put this in as well, continuously measure the program. So in other words, have kind of, once you start to get up and running, you know, make sure you have the finger on the pulse. And I've provided just some recommendations here, just some high level metrics. And some of them are pretty simplistic, right? What are the number of tables that we've cataloged or terms in our glossary? How many data quality issues have we resolved? How many data quality issues have we identified? Just simple metrics, right? Just simple counts. And that can grow into something that's a little bit more higher level, such as like, what's the turnaround or remediation for data quality issues that we've highlighted? Is there differences between different domain areas? Is there differences between different business units? Right? Does it differ between data that ends up in some other systems as opposed to data that, oh, you know, I should have labeled some of these slides like, hey, Siri, go into the higher level metric. Yeah. Anyway. So again, just an example is that we don't need to measure everything, you know, start small, right? You know, dashboards are kind of easy to do if we have just some base metrics, right? And it allows us to kind of figure out. The other thing I do like about dashboards is that they really allow you to kind of socialize and condition behavior. Sorry, I'm 10 minutes over, right? So I put out a dashboard to tell you what it is, but I'm also showing you in a way that lists the behavior I'm hoping to get from you. Okay, so, okay. All right, so last slide, closing thoughts. I've covered most of this. The only thing that I really would say is that using data governance thematically is kind of, and grouping things is an easy way to do less with more, because it allows you to say, if I'm worried about data quality, then I can group things around that and I get some synergies across different data assets. If I group it by, let's say, common data assets or data domains, well, then I probably can do, you know, I can probably, you know, do certain things that are kind of the same questions I answer, the same policies that I implement will impact not just one, but the other one. So why don't we do it together or at the same time? So my point here is just grouping things into kind of a collective kind of similar buckets does provide some efficiencies. Like it does. And you can look at it from a domain perspective. You can look at it from an application perspective. You can look at it from a business unit perspective. You can look at it from a data governance tenant perspective. But pick a lane or two, and then you'll see that there will be some coalescing around the activities, and you realize there's probably some duplication. And when you do one thing, you're actually kind of, it's like a bowling pin effect. You knock one pin over, you get the next two. Okay. Boy, I used up a lot of time here. So that's it. That's all I have. Any questions? Any thoughts? Craig's in the room, so I'll ask. That was helpful. Everyone's going to go, yes.
What tools and services do you use for your data governance? I will give you an example from the infrastructure point. So when we develop the governance and when we see the governance in the client environment in Azure, you know, the naming convention, the rollbacks, access control, Azure policy, resource group, management groups, modeling, and all the stuff. So we know the tools that we use when we build infrastructure governance. With all that information that you provided, what services, tools you can use in Azure to build data governance?
You know, but see, I think that's a problem question. So I can't use a tool to build the data governance. I can have a data governance. I'm using the tool to help enable some of that. So but I get where you're going with it. So, you know, Microsoft is really kind of hard behind Purview, right? It provides some cataloging, some limited kind of lineage, gives you kind of perspectives into kind of, you know, some accessibility, right? And then that product, like, I mean, I did a project with that, well, 2.5 years ago, and it was pretty rough, but it's gotten a lot better and continues. There's a lot of investment with Microsoft into that. You know, Databricks has a tool called Unity, so that their thing is, well, we can help you with the data lake stuff. We can also help you with the database stuff. You know, there's various things, data profiling tools to understand what data quality looks like, but it tends to be a little bit of a mixed bag, right? Because it does become really like, how do you put data stewardship into a tool? You see my point? Like, yeah. You know what I mean? So, but because there is such a heavy weighting on the people and process side of things, But there are some tools there, and they are kind of getting more mature to kind of, hit on more and one of these tenants.